I think it's a really interesting time in TTIP because we're in that kind of uncomfortable middle period. I think we're somewhere just before the halftime whistle goes, and I think it's valid. It's a good time to sort of step back and think about where we are, and that's what you're going to be doing today. And you're really going to be diving down into the issues. I thought I'd offer 4 not entirely random thoughts about TTIP here, and these are how I think about it, and also the conversations that I have with my editors who constantly say, "So when's this thing going to get done? And is it going to get done? And should we, what should we be writing about this?" And I think so I'll start with really point 1, which is I think it's important to remember, and I think this sometimes gets lost in the discussion of the detail, that TTIP is still a valid endeavor. It's a big and valid endeavor, worth stepping back and thinking, okay, this is a trade relationship that is as important as it gets in the world today. Something like $800 billion worth of trade or more last year. And also it's about the future of trade agreements, and really that issue of regulatory coherence that Dan was referencing there, that tangle of regulations that business complains about, and closing those non-tariff barriers that we've been writing about for a long time. But it's also a sort of an interesting point in that in business, I think increasingly, and this is not a phenomenon of the last year or two, but businesses are transatlantic nowadays. The multinational corporation, which once was an American or a European corporation that was reaching out across the world, is now increasingly a transatlantic one. Great examples in Fiat and Chrysler and GM and the auto industry. There. I also think the valid endeavor goes beyond the bilateral or the transatlantic relationship, and really it's it's thinking of it in the context of the WTO and global trade liberalization efforts, and the TPP. Jagdish Bhagwati had the noodle bowl theory of trade, that all these FTAs in the world were going to complicate the world and create a tangle of noodles. I'd like to patent the ravioli theory of trade, and that is that we are now in this ravioli, and if I'm in Asia, I call it the dumpling theory of trade. We are seeing a series of mega regional agreements that are being written or negotiated, and that eventually someday they will become the great lasagna that is the big global multilateral deal. Again, I'm patenting that, so if you use it, please. And I think that's a long-term project. I mean, but clearly, when you talk to people in the U.S. administration, part of the reasoning behind the launch of TPP and also TTIP was about getting something happening in the realm of trade liberalization and moving beyond the kind of paralysis that you have in the Doha round now. So I think that's an important context there. TTIP is also a geopolitical agreement, I would argue, and that's partly because of my background in international relations that Dan pointed to. And I think the geopolitics are as valid for TTIP as they are for TPP. People talk about TPP in the context of China. I think TTIP is equally valid in that context, particularly with what's happening in Russia nowadays, in Ukraine. So these are, to me, the 3 big pillars of why this remains a valid endeavor. The second point that I think about is that great question I get from my editors, which is, okay, this is big. Can you actually get it done, or can they actually get it done? And if so, when? And when you're in the daily news business, this sometimes turns into a slightly depressing conversation. I think the question, the answer that I offer my editors nowadays is yes, it'll get done, but probably not anytime soon. And that may not be the answer that some people in business and others who have a shorter horizon of thinking may want to hear, but I do think that increasingly, in my mind, it's hard to see this getting done during the Obama administration, and that raises all sorts of interesting questions. I think they're going to try to get it done. Clearly, they are trying to get it done. Mike Froman and Cecilia Malmstrom recently agreed to accelerate the negotiations. But really, everything has to go incredibly smoothly to get even close. And as one senior official involved told me when we talked after the Froman-Malmstrom meeting recently, really what we're laying out in front of us just gets us to the mid-game. And I think that is something that is important, especially in the context, and I use TPP as a reference point. TPP, for those of us who cover it, it's been a joke that this thing has been in the end game for 2 years. If TTIP is only just getting to the mid game, we've got a long road ahead there. There's a couple of reasons why I think this is going to struggle to get done in the Obama administration. One is the complexity of the deal. I think a lot of the conversations feel still like they're only just getting started, even though it's been 2 years, and I think that's interesting. The other point is I still think for the U.S. administration, TPP is going to take a lot of energy to get through Congress in the next, to close, to scrub, to get the text out, to sell politically. The administration is really going to be focused on that over the next year or so. I don't think it's a zero-sum game, and clearly the folks at USTR have argued for a long time that they can walk and chew gum at the same time, but there's a question of attention and political pressure as well. I think one of the things you've seen in TPP is sort of a building urgency over the last 2 years. For most of the last 6 to 9 months, if not year, the TPP negotiators have been meeting weekly, essentially, in intercessional agreements. They've been on the phone, they've been closing. If you, especially the US and Japan negotiators have been on the road constantly for most of the last year. So, and I don't see that in TTIP right now. I may be missing something, but I just don't see that accelerated schedule there. I think the other point is that the political timeline ahead is getting very interesting. I don't think in 2016 TTIP is going to draw quite the opposition or the heated debate that TPP is here in the US for obvious reasons. But I'm not sure that in the context of the anti-trade rhetoric we're hearing on both sides, in both parties right now, that even a deal with Europe is going to be immune to that or some kind of blowback. There's an argument that Putin's new Syrian endeavor and his other adventurism in Ukraine and so on could help make that geopolitics case in the Congress, but then there's also, I keep wondering, and I was thinking about this on the plane last night, although not for that long, I wonder what Donald Trump would make of TTIP. If TPP is a disaster, what would he think of TTIP? And I came up with some fun quotes that I was sort of imagining them speaking, and then I switched off and moved on to something else. But but clearly there's potential grist there. But I think 2017 is the more important year in terms of the political timeline. And this gets into why I don't think it'll get done in the Obama administration as well, and that has more to do with European politics rather than here domestically. And that is, you have three monumental votes in Europe in 2017, and that is the German election, national election, French presidential election, and I think equally importantly, the UK referendum on whether or not to be in the remain in the EU. In each of those elections, I would expect TTIP will be an issue that will be vigorously debated. There were 150,000, 200,000 people in the streets of Berlin on Saturday protesting against TTIP. That tells you that certainly there are people who feel strongly about this in Germany. Angela Merkel has been treading very carefully on this. Sigmar Gabriel, her coalition partner, even more so, arguably. But across Europe, there are now 3 million signatures on a petition against TTIP, and that's starting to become a big number. I also think that sort of vocal opposition is bleeding into a kind of broader skepticism about TTIP that I hear from some of my colleagues who are asking me as Europeans as much as economic journalists, but also hear from others in the quiet center now. And I think that is really, really important. I also think the leaders in each of those elections or votes is politically savvy enough to know that there is a risk for them in this debate. I think the third random thought is that the barriers or stumbling blocks are just not going away. And in fact, they're arguably multiplying in different ways. We've long talked about the Snowden effect on data and the discussion there, the kind of how it adds to the suspicion across the Atlantic, particularly in Germany. I think that is still there. I also think the safe harbor decision that we saw recently from the top court in Europe, it's not technically part of TTIP, but it's emblematic of a broader suspicion. And there, I think that's a broader suspicion, but also a sort of a combination of jealousy and angst that you see in Europe now when it comes to the issue of innovation and technology companies, which I think is really interesting and I think will shadow the talks. GMOs, the decision by the European Commission earlier this year to allow member states to opt out of any decision is important. It's a recommendation. It's not a firm decision, but clearly it tells you a lot about the European Commission and how they're going to handle the politics. The ISDS, and I can't believe I've gotten this far without mentioning ISDS, the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism and all of the heat around that. I think there is a view in Brussels that they have come up with a solution with a recent proposal for a wholesale rewriting of the system. I think you only have to look at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's incredibly rapid response to that, negative response to that proposal to see why that may be more difficult than the Europeans think in terms of the negotiations. It has two main points, as far as I can tell. The creation of an international court with sitting judges to hear investment cases. It sounds a lot like ICSID to me, a multilateral institution that will hear these investment disputes. Clearly, ICSID among opponents is a poison brand, so the Europeans want to come up with something entirely fresh. And the second thing is an appellate function for investment cases that would allow governments to go before a panel of sitting judges. I think both fit in very much with this European idea that the answer to a problem is often to set up a new institution. I don't think that goes down so well well, particularly in places like this, and here in Washington more broadly. I think there's myriad other questions out there that are building. There's big questions on whether financial services will be included or not. These are things that should have been answered some time ago, I would have thought. That said, I did say, yes, I think this is going to happen, and that brings me to sort of my fourth and final point, and that is both sides want it to happen at the political level, certainly. So what has to change for it to happen? And I think that is something that the negotiators on both sides have been thinking about a lot and were discussing during that recent meeting. I'm not sure they've got all the answers, but clearly something has to happen to get some kind of new momentum behind TTIP. I think the first thing is really a recalibration of the endeavor. Is this the big totemic catch-all agreement that a lot of its advocates have sought? Should it be that? There were people when I was still based in London who would talk about TTIP as the beginning of a transatlantic, basically a growth of the European Union across the Atlantic, and that it would become a single economy, a single market across the Atlantic. I'm not sure that TTIP, given the current challenges, will get you there. That may be a good long-term goal, but it's not where this is heading. I think particularly with what is happening in the EU and the suspicion within the EU of the EU itself and its role. So I think that's one point of recalibration. So do you focus instead on something that focuses on tariffs, services, maybe some government procurement lines? Do you turn the regulation project into a longer-term project? People have talked about TTIP. I think there's two lines that immediately come to mind with TTIP. One was the let's get this done on a single tank of gas. That has gone away, although the argument now is perhaps we're with an electric car instead of a gas guzzler. And after VW, certainly not a diesel. But I think there's people, and Matteo Renzi was making this point a year or more ago, that there's a kind of early harvest deal to be had, and that regulation is, given its complexity, should be viewed as a longer-term project. I think there's when I talk on or listen or ask questions on regulation, it is still striking to me how much the question of regulation on things like food and auto safety and so on is a kind of a Mars and Venus thing, and I'm not sure you solve that in a trade agreement kind of immediately. The second point is to really accelerate negotiations. I think right now we will see next week an exchange of new tariff offers. This is only the second exchange of tariff offers, and I think that's telling. It's been 2 years. The first one didn't go so well. They've both agreed to set a 97% threshold, and so turn this into a negotiation over the remaining 3% of sensitive tariff lines. But if you're going to go into closing mode in 2016, you need to be meeting more quickly than they are planning to at this point. So tariff offers in next week, and then a procurement offers in February that already takes you into the spring almost. I think the second point is European leaders need to handle the politics better, and they need to be braver if they want to get this done. And I haven't seen any signs of that, particularly from the European Commission, which I think has been a much more political animal under Jean-Claude Juncker than it was under Mr. Barroso. I think one of my questions is, when Cecilia Malmstrom took over, and particularly on the investment issue, I started thinking of her as engaging in the kind of rope-a-dope maneuver of, I'm going to listen, and to all the opponents, and then try and wear them out that way. I don't think that's worked. Clearly, we saw that on Saturday in Berlin. I think, and this may be a provocative point, Americans need to be better in the context of this negotiation at proving their Europeanness, which again is not a comfortable admission for some parts of the polity here. But I've been away for 17 years, and I've just come back, and I am struck by how America has changed in a number of ways, and how the traditional narrative on our different economies and how we regulate has changed. And I think actually the VW example is a great one. It upends the narrative that somehow Europe is greener than the US when it comes to cars. I think the food culture change here is remarkable. The idea that McDonald's is now deciding not to use any antibiotic treated meat or any hormone-fed chicken or beef is important, and it's important in the context of TTIP, because these are exactly the sort of things that European consumers think about when they think about TTIP. The famous chlorinated chicken